This is Phil Chen. I am Decentralized Chief Officer at HTC. I'm here with Professor N.T. Wright, one of my heroes, and one of my favorite thinkers, at least in theology, but somebody who's sort of, during my educational years, really influenced the way I think about the Bible, and hence the way I think about money and power and even technology. And so, and last night, Professor Tom Wright gave a fascinating lecture here titled "Speaking Truth to Power and Money," and it's extremely appropriate for this conversation. We're here at St. John's Cathedral, celebrating the 170th year anniversary, also the oldest church here in Hong Kong, and it's set right beside the Chong Kong Tower this way, and it's the most famous tower here in Hong Kong as well, because it represents the financial hub of Hong Kong, and it's also owned by absolutely the most powerful man here in Hong Kong, who I used to work for too, in the venture capital space. And so it's an honor for us to host you.
Thank you.
Here at St. John's Cathedral.
Thank you. It's great.
And so, yeah, I think, well, it's kind of jumping off from what your conversations yesterday about speaking truth to money and power. There are many fascinating things you talked about last night, but maybe let's just start with, what is money to you? What does the Bible say about money? And what is the biblical view of money? Often it's confused with the conversation about mammon, money.
Yes.
Why it has enslaved us. What is money? Maybe we start
Yes,
there.
it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have the full answer to it, but throughout the biblical period, of course, there are different means of exchange. Sometimes deals will be done on the basis of 5 goats or whatever it is, and then money emerges as a substitute for the exchange of raw goods, I guess. And by the time you get the New Testament period, then money is all over the place. And interestingly for me, money usually has something stamped on it. A coin will have an emperor's head, something on it. And the Jewish people, out of whom Jesus comes, are hugely sensitive about this, partly because they're not supposed to make images of anything anyway, but also because there's a political dimension to it.
Sure.
That if this is Caesar's head, well, we would rather be free people and we would rather not have Caesar's coinage here, thank you very much. So that says to me right there that money carries messages and talks about political power, talks about control, and talks about ways of manipulating people to do and be things they mightn't actually necessarily want to be. And so that it's money as a means of exchange is, I think, in the Bible just taken for granted by Jesus' time, but people are very much aware both that it can be worshipped and then that will do really bad things to you, and that it can carry political messages, and then what are you going to do about that? And hence the question to Jesus, do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus' famous reply about rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And I think in all sorts of ways contemporary Christians in the 21st century haven't really done a lot of hard thinking about how that all works. We're aware that the debt crisis has been a serious problem. Mm-hmm. We're aware that subprime mortgages have got a lot of people, both little people and big people, if you like, into serious difficulties. But I'm not hearing too many people saying creative things as ways through and out the other side of that. So yes, that's a conversation, I think, waiting to happen.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, so when Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, was he talking about money, or was he talking about power? Was it both?
It's a good question.
Many layers.
Sure. We need to contextualize that. When Jesus was a little boy, there were riots in the Jewish world, in Galilee and Judea, because the Romans were taking a census, and the reason you take a census is so that you know who you can tax. This is not just for idle statistics.
Sure.
We want to put some numbers in a file somewhere. We want to know who's going to be paying us money. So that people rioted against the census, and there were Jews who were crucified for refusing to pay the tax when Jesus was a little boy. The idea of crucifixion was very well known. So if Jesus is claiming to be spearheading God's kingdom, the kingdom of God, then this is going to be the question. So do we have to pay the tax to Caesar or don't we? Now, when Jesus then says, pay back Caesar what is Caesar's, that is an echo of quite a well-known saying which you find in the book called First Maccabees, where 200 years before Jesus' time, it isn't Rome that they're worried about, it's Syria, and the Syrian king is trying to control Judea, and the slogan is, pay back the Gentiles what they deserve. Now that doesn't mean pay them back the tax, it means rebel, revolt, give them as good as you got. So when Jesus says, pay back to Caesar what Caesar deserves, I think some people would hear, because he's holding a coin, pay back to, so some people would hear it simply as saying, yeah, pay the tax, and others would say, oh, is this a revolutionary slogan? What does that mean? And then he says, and pay God back what God deserves. And this is, it's not a kind of a modern ethical rule that here is Caesar's domain and here's God's domain. That's a late modern misunderstanding. It's a deliberately cryptic, multi-sided answer to a very dangerous question.
Yes.
And I have worked a little bit in British politics because as a bishop that's what I was having to do. And the journalists will come and ask you a tricky question. What do you think about this issue or that? And often it's a question that they'll get you either way. And the wise person develops a skill of telling little stories which navigate through that. That's what Jesus is doing. So we can't simply pick that up and say, there you are, that's the rule, there's God and Caesar or whatever. We've got to be much wiser and richer and deeper than that.
Yes. And last night you also mentioned the 2008 financial crisis, the debt forgiving. Maybe describe what you were saying there, and also that's where I'm going to relate it to this thing called Bitcoin, which I'll explain what it is.
Oh, interesting. Yes,
it was also a deep reaction to the 2008 bailouts.
Okay. I was Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010, which meant I was in the House of Lords in London. Not that I could get there more than 2 or 3 times a month, but that's how the system works. And I found myself in a debate in the House of Lords on what to do now that the crash had happened. And it was fascinating. There were about, 30 or 40 speakers, and all of them except me were worried about how to put the system back together again, because oh dear, it's not going to work. I was the only one who pointed out that the people who were really suffering as a result of all this were the poorest of the poor.
Sure.
I lived at that time in a small town in West County Durham in the northeast of England, and I watched as shops and banks on the high street were shutting down, were being boarded up, and people would walk down their high street and maybe 2/3 of the premises were all boarded up. And I would then go to London and see that, London had bounced back, this is no problem. It was a little blip, but we got over it. And I had a strong sense then that an awful lot of people in power were really ignoring what was going on for the people who were already poor and for whom this crash was making things worse. So then when you stand back and say what was going on, I and others had campaigned for years for the remission of unpayable global debt, particularly by sub-Saharan African countries and Philippines and other countries like that, where the big banks had lent them money over the years and they hadn't been able to pay, and the compound interest was just getting higher and higher and higher. And whereas if that happens to an individual, they can go bankrupt and start again, but a country can't do that.
Yes.
And so
For generations.
For generations, exactly. And the generations that were then trying to pay the compound interest were producing the wrong sort of economics, were producing the wrong sort of business models, etc. And every time they said we should remit this, then the pompous banks would say, oh no, you can't do that because, you know, if you get let off debts, then goodness knows what will happen. Quite suddenly in 2008, the banks themselves ran out of cash,
right.
and they flew in their private jets to Washington or London to say, oh dear, we've run out of money, please can we have a handout, or please can we have our debts remitted. And what I said last night in my lecture, which I've said many times, is the very rich did for the very rich what they'd refused to do for the very poor.
Right.
Now, I'm not an economist, but it's actually common sense to say something is wrong with that picture. Now, what precisely is wrong and what precisely should be done about it I know it's a very difficult question. There's not an easy answer to that. But I think we can't simply, especially from a Christian point of view, we can't simply look at that and say, oh, well, that's the way the world is, never mind. We'll let the bankers go on paying themselves vast bonuses, and too bad if all the shops in Bishop Auckland shut down. You know, it'll all even out. That sort of laissez-faire system, I think Jesus would have pretty sharp words for it.
Sure. So have you heard of Bitcoin?
I've heard of Bitcoin. I really don't know very much about it.
Sure. Yeah, and Bitcoin.
I see it mentioned in the news and so on.
Bitcoin is this, strange currency.
What do they call it? A cryptocurrency?
Yeah, it's a cryptocurrency, and it was written by this anonymous person named Satoshi Nakamoto. He wrote this, literally this white paper, dropped it out of nowhere. It was clear that it was a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis and the bailouts.
A way of having a different money system.
Yes, but it was a complete rebellion towards the central banks and how they bailed out each other. As you say, the rich bailing out the rich.
Yeah.
And so what the Bitcoin was saying, this is enough. We're going to define our own money, and this money can be created by a community of people. Right? And it's anybody who has, long story short, a computer that can mine for this digital currency.
Right.
Now, one of the big innovations, and you'll probably understand this too, is in software and in digital content, it's easy to copy things, right? So when you have a piece of music or a Wagner handle, you send me that file and we both have the same file, right?
Yeah.
One of the big innovations in Bitcoin that was able to create this value or this digital medium of exchange, some people call it digital cash, is that when you give me a Bitcoin, then you no longer have that Bitcoin.
Yeah, right.
It had to solve that problem.
Right.
And so it was able to solve that problem. And so that's one facet. But I think the deep why behind Bitcoin is a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis. And this person or group of person or Satoshi Nakamoto basically, January 2009, put out the first Bitcoin.
Okay.
And then people started.
Right.
It was a crowdfunding, and people call this a decentralization movement because it's no longer sort of betting on or relying on a central authority that tells you who owns what.
Right. And presumably, if it's global, it's unregulated.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that's also the danger behind it too, because it's open, it's neutral, it's censorship resistant, and then it's borderless.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Which is all kind of like the opposite of what you just referred to when a central government.
Yes.
And the Romans wanted to take a census.
Yes.
Because so that they could tax people, right?
Yep.
And so now, because of this borderless, open, censorship-resistant, neutral sort of cryptocurrency, things can be untraceable back to more like cash. Because it's open, neutral, censorship-resistant, and borderless. Often it's like digital cash. It's not traceable.
Yeah.
And so then the conversation around privacy becomes central. Because in this digital world that we live in today, almost everything is tracked.
Yeah.
Often what I hear is, people search on Google things
Yes.
they would never tell their wives or their friends or their closest family. That's kind of been their deepest conversations they've had. That data, or your anything that you buy, people you interact with, your social graph.
It's all somewhere on
It's all somewhere.
somewhere in some cloud or other.
Yes, and these clouds are centralized right now.
Right.
They've become the new power, so to speak.
Yes, yes.
And so, namely 7 companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and here in Asia, it's Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. These 7 companies together is more powerful than any government. They've become what I like to term the biggest brothers of all time.
Wow.
Because now they have surveillance of not just what you are or you searching for, or all your friends, but they're able to predict what you want to buy, what you in the future, and even start obviously with the whole Cambridge Analytica incident, control how you think and what to think
and what you vote for.
Yes.
Yeah. Which then snowballs, because if they can make you vote in a particular way, that then will have other spin-off effects.
And so Bitcoin, although started out as sort of a rebellion towards centralized money, it's now become a movement in terms of challenging centralized power as well.
Interesting.
Because now the power brokers are those that hold the data.
Right.
Because with data, you're able to predict. Right, they're the new prophets, so to speak.
Wow.
They're the new kings and the new prophets.
Yes. That's very interesting. And I mean, the whole idea then of transcending traditional countries, traditional regulatory schemes, traditional borders, I think we're all vaguely aware that that's going on, but that is going on at the same time as for instance, at the moment there's a lot of talk, certainly in the British media, of a kind of a trade war between the US and China, or then of course all the Brexit issues and so on, which in a sense are old, traditional, rather grungy geopolitics. But that's going on at one level with potential military and economic consequences. But then at this totally other level, all this stuff is happening, and I'm not sure even how the two relate.
Yeah. And so with as many layers, Bitcoin, government, data, wealth, privacy, myself as an entrepreneur, I'm also having a theology background, I'm wrestling with how do I speak to power?
Yes.
Right? How do I speak truth to power?
Yes.
This is the sign of the times.
Yes. And I mean, it may sound very traditional, but what I was saying last night, and which I think I would still hold to, and I hope this isn't just because I am the age I am and all this sounds like too much modern stuff for me, but I really do believe in real human communities, in smallish local communities. They say with mega churches that every Christian needs to belong to one group of roughly 70 people and another group of roughly 10 or a dozen people with whom they can be open and honest, and with whom they can pray, with whom they can share fellowship and particularly share outward facing projects for the good of their local communities. And it seems to me that whatever is happening on these other fronts, if we end up with non-communities that simply consist of lots of isolated individuals sitting in their own small rooms in front of a keyboard, then this is actually deeply dehumanizing. This is actually destructive of what it means to be human. Great German theologian of the last generation, Wolfhard Pannenberg, spoke of humans as being essentially what he called exocentric. That is to say, we find out who we are not by looking deeply inside, but by who we relate to and how we relate to them. And if that relating is simply done by means of computers, then that is actually a diminution, quite a serious diminution of what it means to be human. And it becomes very seductive. Like other idolatries, you get a quick shot of something. I mean, I got a news flash this morning on when I woke up and got an email from somebody, and I just checked it out, went straight onto one of the search engines and saw, oh, okay, that's what's going on there, fine. But as you say, somewhere in some cloud that will be logged that, N.T. Wright looked at that thing this morning. But that's not human relating. And I think there would then be a matter of saying, how do we learn in this new world the meaning of love.
That's right.
And that's a real and powerful and important question. I worry that we will move through a generation where my children's generation, my grandchildren's generation, will actually not find the rich dimensions of being human that I would want for them and that I would say God wants for them. And that's a real puzzle.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to know how you, as an entrepreneur in this technological world, relate to that.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got children who will grow up, and
I absolutely wrestle with that. I think most of my friends, or even Justin's friends, we see a lot of people around us that they meet new people through social media, and that's kind of like the primary place that people meet each other.
Right.
And the deep struggle with the millennial workforce, for example, is work has also taken much or if not most of our time.
Yes.
And hence then the narrative becomes, oh, we don't get to meet new people. We don't get to meet people at all. And so there's no opportunity for a communal, sort of serendipitous way of meeting someone.
Right.
And hence it's all, people have outsourced sort of their dating into social media.
Isn't that odd? I know, and again, I watch this going on. I don't do very much social media stuff myself, except within my immediate family. And because we're quite scattered as a family, that's quite a useful thing. I had a message from one of my grandchildren this morning, and that's fine. Hi, how are you doing? But I then do worry. I worry about it with my children, grandchildren, but also my students. Because the students that I teach, many of them are extremely active on social media, and I think then when it's a matter of creating a persona for oneself, there's a danger, which we're all subject to at one level or another, of actually self-deception. Of, I want to be this sort of a person, so I put a persona out of myself, I choose photographs to post, I do this, I do that, so that the world that I'm really connecting with, if that's my main contact, actually gets this portrait of me rather than actually knowing me face to face.
Yes.
That's a very
and
very dehumanizing.
Yes, and one narrative which again ties back to both social media and which I want to get to, at least how we define money today.
Okay.
Is there's this monolithic definition of what that is, in the sense that, so you were talking about communities of 70 people.
Yeah.
That's a relatively small community, but you get to know people.
Yeah.
But in that 70 people, 70 to 150 people maybe, you also, in a serendipitous way, define the means of communicating, and you started developing your own language, the nuance. The huge problem with I think these monolithic services, social media, is it's become, this is how you talk.
Yes.
Right, and this is the only way how people interact, and this is how you meet people. Right. And it goes back to what this one definition of what money is, because money at the core of it, as somebody asked you last night, is money inherently evil?
Yes.
I also agree with what you say. It's inherently a tool. It can be used for both good and evil. But I think at its core, the way it's defined, it's three things. It's an agreement within a community for some exchange of value. Right. And the problem is, I think, with money, is that agreement within the community has been just one agreement that everybody has to agree to, rather than many small communities that have diverse difference of or a diverse way of agreeing on this medium of exchange. And so we lose a lot of diversity. We lose, and then it becomes, because there's only one definition of money, and the way money is defined today is inherently competitive. And as you say, like interest rates, debts,
yes.
the way it's set up is very competitive, and hence there's a whole new community of people who are trying to define their own local currency or monies that are more collaborative, that are more. It doesn't have to be, interest based.
Right.
Debt.
Rather like what I mean in the Church of England at the moment, because our current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was in the oil business before he got ordained. He's very sensitive to economic and those issues, and he had a big campaign 2-3 years ago because we have various in the UK what are called payday lenders, where people will prey on the poorest of the poor and offer to lend them money against their next payday, but the interest rates are huge, and so it's basically a way of attacking the poor and getting more money out of them, and then when they can't pay, they have to get into further debt, etc. And Justin Welby, and the churches have been doing this for quite some while, but I think he's developed schemes on this, doing local credit unions where within a local church community a system would be set up to help the poorest of the poor to manage such money as they've got, and if they really don't have any to speak of, to help them find ways into, whether it's starting small businesses or whatever. And that's very much what you're saying about the local community, and I think it's a great thing for the church to be doing, helping people out of this monolithic structure which is crushing them. But that's very much a conversation between modernity and postmodernity, isn't it? The money in the modern world has become this big thing. I suppose if you go back 300 or 400 years, there will be lots of different currencies in any area, and the financial system has become part of the modern construct, which works for the people who run it. But then the postmodern rebellion, and I would see Bitcoin as very much a classic postmodern thing, is a way of saying we're going to do our own little narrative and we're going to run it ourselves, and we're going to cock a snook at you, at the big boys. And that's a fascinating social phenomenon, but as with other postmodern phenomena, I would worry that too can become dehumanizing. I mean, the problem with postmodernity, it seems to me, is that we lose all sense of identity. By saying I want my own identity, hang on, who am I? I'm part of this, I'm part of that. We deconstruct. And so somehow there needs to be a wiser conversation which is neither collapsing back into the old monolithic modernity nor deconstructing into the random flux of postmodernity. One of the things that frustrates me about life in the churches is that often people go to church in order to step back from all of that and not engage at all. And I'm interested in engaging with the real world. But that's difficult.
And so maybe talk a little bit about, and you also referred to this yesterday a bit, the concept of Jubilee.
Of Jubilee, yeah.
What is it? Why was it set
It's
up?
fascinating, isn't it? It's a historical puzzle, because as we look at the history of the Jewish world, it's not clear that the biblical Jubilee as set out in the Pentateuch, in the books of Moses, was ever really put into operation in the way that people envisaged. They probably did try it. The idea was that once every 50 years, then a line would be drawn, and if people had got hopelessly into debt, that would all be written off, to stop the rich just going on getting richer and the poor getting poorer and poorer. And so it was like the Sabbath. The Sabbath is once a week. There is a day in which you anticipate the coming day of freedom.